Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. Of all the singular events that I have recorded during my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, few have lingered in my mind with such persistent unease as the affair of the East India treasure. It was a case draped in superstition, whispered of in drawing rooms with lowered voices, and dismissed by men of science as mere folklore. And yet beneath its spectral trappings lay a scheme so cunning, so elaborately constructed, that even I, who had witnessed Holmes unravel the most impenetrable of mysteries, found myself shuddering at its implications. For years, I hesitated to set pen to paper, unsure whether such an account might provoke ridicule or disbelief. But now, with the principal figures either dead or scattered, and with Holmes himself no longer among the living to raise a sardonic eyebrow at public reaction, I feel a duty to commit the truth to record. Perhaps it is only in the telling that a man can fully exorcise the ghosts of his past. The tale begins, as many do, not in some remote corner of the empire, or amidst the ancient ruins of forgotten civilizations, but in the warmly lit parlour of our Baker Street lodgings, where a knock upon the door and a frightened man's trembling voice would draw us into a mystery cloaked in legend, but born of very human darkness. It was on a blustery evening in late October, the sort of night when the gas lamps flicker and even the fire seems to burn with a nervous flicker, that I found myself seated opposite Holmes, who was sprawled languidly upon the settee, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had spent the better part of the afternoon perusing a monograph on Burmese poisons, and the room bore the lingering odour of some unpleasant chemical with which he had been experimenting. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes like a restless hand at the glass. I had just remarked upon the storm's ferocity when the doorbell rang. A sudden, jarring sound that made Holmes's eyebrows arch in mild curiosity. "Strange hour for visitors," I murmured. "Indeed, Watson," said he, springing to his feet with that peculiar energy he seemed to summon at the scent of the unusual. "Let us see what manner of bird has flown into our little cage." Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later, her face pale and her voice hushed. "A gentleman, sir, quite distressed. Insisted he must see Mr. Holmes at once." She stepped aside, and into the room stepped a tall, gaunt man of military bearing, his eyes wide and haunted, his hands trembling despite the thick wool of his coat. Rain glistened upon his shoulders, and something in his countenance spoke not merely of fear, but of guilt. The man gave his name as Captain Lionel Hathaway, late of Her Majesty's East India Company, now returned to England to take possession of his ancestral estate near Portsmouth. Holmes gestured for him to sit, and I, perceiving the poor fellow's agitation, poured him a measure of brandy, which he accepted with a wordless nod. "You must forgive me," he began, his voice low and hoarse. "I have come here not for justice. Indeed, I scarcely know what justice would mean in such a case, but for clarity, for truth. I cannot endure the whispers any longer." Holmes leaned forward slightly, the tips of his fingers pressed together. "Start at the beginning, Captain. Spare no detail, however trivial it may seem." Hathaway drew a long breath. "My uncle, Colonel Josiah Hathaway, passed away some months ago. He had served in India for many years, and there were always rumours, half-spoken hints, that he had come into possession of certain valuables, relics, perhaps even jewels, acquired during his campaigns. The East India treasure, they called it. He paused and glanced nervously at the window, though it was shuttered against the storm. 3 weeks ago, the chest vanished from a locked vault beneath the drawing room. There were no signs of entry, no disturbance. And then the sightings began. A shadowed figure in the hallway wearing a turban, strange sounds at night, a stain like blood on the floor each morning. The servants speak of a ghost. The ghost, they say, of a betrayed sepoy who died cursing my uncle's name. And you? Holmes asked quietly. Captain Hathaway's voice dropped to a whisper. I believe the curse has come for the treasure, and for those who stole it. Captain Hathaway's voice, though steadier now, still bore the cadence of a man burdened by dread. It began with whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurings in the night. At first, I thought them dreams, but the staff heard them too. Then came the sightings. Fleeting glimpses of a tall figure draped in white, its head wrapped in a turban, moving noiselessly along the upper landing. Beatrice, my niece, claims she saw it peer through the drawing room door before vanishing. There were no footprints, no trace. Holmes was utterly still, his eyes half-lidded, though I knew his mind to be leaping across invisible ledges of logic. And the stain? He inquired. Hathaway nodded grimly. Each morning, on the flagstones outside the study door, a dark red smear like blood, though it dries too quickly for that. We scrub it, and yet it returns the next day, always in the same place. The servants have grown terrified. One has already left. The others avoid the east wing entirely. I could not help but feel a prickle at the back of my neck. For all my medical rationalism, there was something unnerving in Hathaway's calm account, precisely because he did not attempt to embellish it. Holmes finally rose and crossed to the fire, warming his hands as though considering whether to entertain folly or challenge it. You do not believe in spirits, Captain, he said at last, yet you speak of one as if it were a fact. I don't know what I believe, the man replied, his voice low. But I do know this. If something is trying to frighten us away from that house, it is succeeding. I must confess, Holmes said, turning to face our visitor with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, that I find this tale invigorating, though not, I think, for the reasons you suppose. Captain Hathaway looked puzzled. You mean to say, sir, that you don't believe it to be supernatural? Holmes waved his hand dismissively. My dear Captain, I have encountered more phantoms in men's motives than I have ever found in their attics. No, what you present is not the tale of a ghost, but of a ghost story, constructed, I suspect, with a purpose. He paced slowly across the rug, the folds of his dressing gown trailing behind like the cloak of a conjurer. Consider, Watson, a vanished treasure, a legend tied to Eastern betrayal, and a series of apparitions that follow no discernible pattern save that they escalate fear. Fear is a tool, and like any tool, it is wielded by someone with intent. I saw the flicker of realization begin to dawn in Hathaway's eyes. But the vault, he said. It was locked. Ah, said Holmes, but you did not find it locked. You believed it was locked. That distinction may prove crucial. Tell me, was there anyone in the house at the time of the disappearance whom you have since dismissed? Hathaway hesitated. Holmes's voice grew quieter, colder. A locked door may be more illusion than fact, as indeed might your ghost. And with that, he turned to me. Pack your bag, Watson. I believe the game has already begun. We departed Baker Street early the next morning, the mist still heavy over the streets of London, giving the familiar avenues an otherworldly aspect that did little to dispel the lingering discomfort of our previous evening's interview. Holmes was in one of his lean, silent moods, his long limbs folded tightly beneath his Inverness, his gaze fixed beyond the window of the railway carriage as if seeking the outline of the mystery already waiting for us, beyond the vales of Hampshire. "I gather, Watson," he said at length, "that you remain unconvinced by our visitor's tale." "I do," I replied, "not unconvinced that something is afoot, but rather by the ghostly dressing it has been given. If a treasure has vanished, surely we are dealing with a theft. As for the rest, well, I know enough of human nerves to see how easily one shadow can become a phantom when fear has already taken root." Holmes gave a dry chuckle. "Just so. But we must remember, it is often the appearance of the thing, and not the thing itself, which yields the most fruit. We are not merely pursuing stolen property, Watson. We are hunting a design, and the mind that conceived this particular design is not, I think, an amateur." As we drew closer to Portsmouth, the land turned damp and sodden, with fields stretching into grey horizons. Somewhere beyond lay Hathaway Manor, an old house full of whispers, a vanished treasure, and, if local gossip were to be believed, a ghost clad in Eastern garb. Holmes remained composed. I, on the other hand, could not help but feel that we were entering territory as yet uncharted by reason alone. Our carriage turned from the main road just as the daylight waned behind a curtain of low cloud, and the remainder of our journey took us through a series of narrow tree-lined lanes, whose twisted branches clawed at the sky. When at last Hathaway Manor came into view, it presented a singularly cheerless appearance, an old Jacobean house of grey stone, whose windows seemed to watch us with weary suspicion. Captain Hathaway met us at the door. He had regained some of his composure, but his voice remained taut, and his eyes moved constantly, as if expecting to catch some shadow at play behind him. "You must forgive the state of things," he said, leading us through the draughty corridors. "I've had to dismiss 2 maids, and the rest are too frightened to remain in the East Wing." We were shortly introduced to his niece, Miss Beatrice Hathaway, a young woman of no great beauty but considerable intelligence, whose frank gaze and steady voice immediately impressed me. She greeted Holmes with interest rather than awe. "You don't strike me as a man easily persuaded by tales of ghosts, Mr. Holmes," she said. "I have found, Miss Hathaway," Holmes replied, "that tales of ghosts are most often authored by the living." Beatrice nodded. "I quite agree. My uncle does not relish these fancies, but he fears what he cannot explain. And there is something in this house. I have heard the sounds myself." Holmes glanced at me, and I knew he had already noted more in her words than I could have. The game, as he liked to say, was afoot, but it had already touched more lives than we yet understood. It was not long before we were introduced to 2 other inhabitants of the house, men whose presence, Holmes later remarked, represented the twin poles of truth and delusion. The first was Mr. Amrit Das, a man of Indian descent, lean and formal in manner, whose family had reportedly served the Hathaways during their time in Calcutta. He answered questions directly, without embellishment, though I thought I glimpsed some hesitation in his manner, as though weighed down by knowledge he dared not voice. Holmes questioned him briefly regarding the night of the disappearance. Das claimed to have seen nothing, heard nothing, and had been in the servants' quarters all evening. When asked about the legends surrounding the treasure, he merely said, "There are many tales in India, Sahib. Some are true, and some are convenient." The second figure was Reverend Josiah Ellison, a man of florid complexion and fanatical mien, who had come to the house that very week, apparently to provide spiritual comfort in what he described as an atmosphere thick with restless energy. "The curse is no fiction," he told us solemnly. "There is something here, something older than England, and twice as angry." Holmes's expression remained politely impassive, but I had come to know the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth that signalled skepticism. "Tell me, Reverend," Holmes inquired mildly, "do angry spirits typically confine themselves to appearing only when all doors are bolted and the household is alone?" "I do not pretend to understand the ways of the beyond," Ellison said, "but I know the presence of sin when I feel it." Holmes only nodded, his eyes narrowing. We had met our cast of characters. The play, it seemed, was ready to begin. Captain Hathaway led us to the eastern end of the house, where a broad oak-panelled drawing room bore signs of long disuse. The air within was stale, as though little life had passed through it for many years. In the far corner, half obscured by an aging chaise, a heavy iron ring jutted from the floorboards. "This," said Hathaway, gesturing downward, "is the entrance to the vault. It was my uncle's own design, stone-lined, sealed from above, and accessible only through this trap-door." Holmes kneeled and examined the latch mechanism with great care. The iron ring moved freely, and the wood bore no signs of chisel or tampering. Hathaway produced a brass key and handed it to Holmes, who inserted it into a small lock hidden within the decorative carving beside the ring. A soft click followed, and the panel lifted with surprising ease. We descended a narrow stair to find ourselves in a small, square chamber lined with stone and faintly damp from the encroaching earth. In its centre stood a carved wooden pedestal, empty. Dust lay in a circle around it, undisturbed save for a single trail leading away to the wall, where nothing but cold masonry met the eye. Holmes's gaze moved with sharp calculation from one corner to another. "There was something heavy here, recently removed," he said at last. "But how?" I asked. "There's only one entrance, and it was locked." Holmes touched the stone floor with his fingers, then examined the hinges of the trap-door above. "Quite so. Which begs the question, did the chest ever leave this room at all?" Captain Hathaway paled. "You think it's still in the house?" "I think," Holmes murmured, "that someone wished us to believe it was not." We returned to the drawing room above, and Holmes began a more meticulous search, his long fingers trailing lightly along the panelled walls, tapping in intervals that to my ears meant little, but to him suggested concealed features or inconsistencies in construction. Presently, he paused beside the fireplace and bent low. "What do you make of this, Watson?" I stepped closer. Upon the stone hearth, scarcely visible except by the firelight's flicker, was a faint discoloration, like a scorch mark, curved at one edge, as though made by the edge of a flame. "Someone lit a candle here recently," Holmes observed. "Not for light, but perhaps to leave a trace, intentionally or otherwise." He straightened and turned to the doorframe. There, on the lowest moulding, lay a thin smear of something dark. Holmes drew out his pocket magnifier and examined it, then sniffed lightly. "Sandalwood," he said with interest. "A scent not easily acquired in Hampshire. It is associated, of course, with India, often used in religious rituals, or in the composition of perfumes." Captain Hathaway looked startled. "You think this was left to implicate someone?" "I think," Holmes replied coolly, "that it was left to suggest something, namely, that the presence haunting this house is of Eastern origin. But this scent was applied after the vault was opened. A ghost, it seems, knows when to make an entrance." Moments later, Holmes reached down beneath a side table and withdrew a small object. "Aha," he said softly, holding it up for our inspection. A broken monocle of excellent quality, and not, I should say, of Indian manufacture. He tucked it into his coat with a look of satisfaction. A scent from the east, a lens from the west. Now all we need is a motive, and the ghost will begin to take shape. That night, we were granted a glimpse of the phantom itself. Holmes had arranged for the household to retire early. Only he and I remained in the eastern wing, seated in silence within a dim parlour that overlooked the corridor where sightings had been most frequent. The lamps had been turned low, the shutters drawn, and our ears sharpened by the silence. An hour passed, perhaps 2, when Holmes suddenly stiffened beside me. A sound, faint as a whisper, but unmistakable, drifted from the hallway. The soft creak of a floorboard, followed by what I can only describe as the faint rustle of cloth against stone. We moved without a word, Holmes signalling for caution. Peering from the cracked doorway, I beheld a figure standing in the gloom just beyond the arch. A tall silhouette, garbed in white, its head wrapped in what appeared to be a turban. It did not walk, but drifted, or so it seemed, down the length of the corridor. I felt my pulse quicken in spite of myself. Holmes stepped forward suddenly. The figure froze, then, with astonishing swiftness, turned and vanished behind a panel in the wall. We gave chase, but upon reaching the panel, found it closed and seemingly immovable. Holmes examined it for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Well constructed," he said, "but not impenetrable. Whoever designed this passage did not intend for it to be discovered easily." We returned to our rooms in silence, though my thoughts remained far from settled. Had I truly seen something human? Or had some subtle trick of light and suggestion conspired to deceive even my reason? Holmes, for his part, remained serene. As he lit his pipe, he murmured, "Now, Watson, the ghost has made its move. Tomorrow, we begin making ours." The following morning found Holmes uncommonly active. Before breakfast had been served, he had already scoured the eastern corridor, pacing its length with a lantern in one hand and a magnifier in the other. I followed him with a mixture of admiration and confusion, for where my eyes perceived only dusty flooring, his seemed to glean information from the subtlest of scuffs and indentations. "Observe, Watson," he said at last, pointing to a series of marks that trailed from the drawing-room door toward the staircase. "Note the peculiar curvature in the heel, quite unlike the square-set boots of our host. And here, do you see how the dust is disturbed, not merely pressed down, but dragged lightly across the surface?" I bent to examine the marks. "It appears to have been made by a slipper." "Just so," Holmes replied. "More precisely, by an Indian slipper of the kind worn by household servants or travelling fakirs. But here is the curious part. The stride length remains constant, precise, as though placed deliberately." "You suspect someone has forged the tracks?" "I do. Not merely forged, but choreographed. These prints serve a purpose, not to show where a person has gone, but to suggest that someone has been. A phantom's calling card, if you will." He crouched once more and touched a section of the skirting board near the staircase. "Here, an abrasion. Someone has braced themselves while leaning to place the prints. And this," he held up a faint smear, "appears to be residue from lampblack or soot. It is theatre, Watson, a pantomime in ghostly costume. And the performer." Holmes's eyes glittered. "He watches us, I have no doubt. Let him play his part. The final act draws near." It was scarcely an hour later when a shriek from the upper landing sent the household into a flurry of movement. We rushed to the source and found one of the housemaids, a timid girl by the name of Clara, collapsed upon the floor outside the linen cupboard. Her face was ashen, and she could barely speak for trembling. "It floated," she managed. "By the saints, I saw it, floating through the air." We helped her to her feet, and she pointed down the corridor with a trembling finger. A box, jewelled, golden, it was in the air, moving on its own. Holmes was immediately at the scene. He examined the floor and walls, and then opened the cupboard door, revealing a tangle of cleaning cloths and dustpans, nothing more. At the foot of the stairs lay a small wooden box, no larger than a cigar case, inlaid with tiny ruby-coloured stones. Holmes picked it up carefully. "It is not levitating now," he said dryly, "and no ghost would abandon a possession so precious without reason." Clara refused to remain in the house another hour. Captain Hathaway, torn between frustration and helplessness, offered her a month's wages to stay, but she fled without so much as a backward glance. The mood in the household shifted palpably. Even the rational Miss Beatrice now seemed troubled. "I fear," she confided in me, "that something more than hysteria afflicts this place. If it is all a trick, then the trickster is cruel." Holmes, meanwhile, was absorbed in the box's design. He turned it over in his hands, then held it up to the light. "This is not Indian," he murmured. "Italian, I would wager. A theatrical prop again, Watson. And yet our conjurer becomes careless. His sleight of hand grows hurried." Though I had long schooled myself against fancy and folklore, I must admit that a strange unease settled upon me in the days that followed. There was something in the air at Hathaway Manor, an oppressive stillness, punctuated by moments of inexplicable dread. I am not a man prone to nervous sentiment, yet even I began to glance over my shoulder more often than custom required. Still, I could not silence the voice of logic that stirred within me. One afternoon, while Holmes and I walked the length of the garden path beneath a sky heavy with cloud, I gave voice to my thoughts. "There is, I believe, a mind behind all of this," I said. "Not a spirit, not a curse, but a very real, very human mind. These incidents are too precisely timed, too carefully placed." Holmes gave a satisfied hum. "Bravo, Watson. You grow ever closer to the rhythm of the thing. And tell me, what sort of mind do you suspect? One that wishes to instill fear, to create an illusion so convincing that no one dares question the story being told?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And what is the ultimate goal of fear, if not to drive people away from something they are otherwise entitled to possess?" We paused at the stone bench near the conservatory. Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe. "The ghost is but a curtain," he said. "What we must determine now is who stands behind it and what he intends to conceal." The evening brought with it a stillness I can only describe as foreboding. Holmes, after supper, invited Mr. Amrit Das to join us for a private word in the study. The butler entered with quiet dignity, his hands folded before him and his expression unreadable. Yet there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested a burden long carried. Holmes gestured to a chair. "Mr. Das, I believe you know why we have asked to speak with you." Das nodded, though he remained silent. Holmes continued. "I will not insult your intelligence by repeating what I already suspect, but I would ask that you trust me. The time has come for truth. Truth not as weapon, but as shield." Das was motionless for several moments. Then, with a sigh that seemed torn from deep within, he spoke. My father served Colonel Hathaway in India. I was a boy then. We lived in Calcutta, in the quarters behind the British barracks. My uncle was in the employ of a local Rajah, a good man, if such can be said of those days. It was he who entrusted a cache of jewels to Colonel Hathaway for safekeeping during a period of civil unrest. He paused. Holmes made no move to interrupt. My uncle was later accused of rebellion and executed by the company's command. The jewels were never returned. My father suspected betrayal, but he never spoke openly. When the colonel returned to England, he offered my family passage and service in his household. My father accepted, for survival, not honour. And you? Holmes asked softly. I remained, silent. But I never forgot, nor did others. Holmes leaned back in his chair. So, this treasure, if it exists, is not merely wealth, it is restitution. Das's voice grew firmer. Or revenge. The room fell into silence once more, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, a wind began to rise. The next morning, as Holmes and I took our tea in the breakfast parlour, Captain Hathaway entered bearing a sealed envelope in his hand. His complexion had paled noticeably, and I noted a distinct tremor in his fingers as he handed it to Holmes. This arrived by messenger at first light, he said. No name, no return address. Delivered by a boy who fled before I could question him. Holmes opened the envelope without a word. Inside was a single sheet of coarse paper, folded once and bearing no signature. Upon it, in sharp, deliberate Urdu script, were written the following words. Leave this house before the festival of light, or the light shall leave you. I confess, even I felt a shiver as I read the translation Holmes provided. A threat? I asked. A promise, Holmes murmured, and a carefully timed one. Diwali approaches within 2 nights. Our adversary has chosen his symbolism well. Beatrice, who had entered moments earlier, glanced over Holmes's shoulder. Who would write such a thing? Holmes's expression darkened. Someone who understands the power of fear and its theatrical potential. Our ghost is no longer content with vague impressions. He now speaks. The drama enters its final act. We spent the day reinforcing our observations. Holmes revisited the drawing room vault, this time measuring the dimensions of the eastern wall with peculiar interest. He requested that I assist him in noting irregularities along the wainscoting, and at one point he even borrowed a carpenter's rule and a lamp. By late afternoon, he appeared satisfied. That night, shortly after 11, an odd flickering light appeared in the upper hallway. I followed Holmes to investigate. As we ascended the stairs, a smell, pungent, acrid, met our nostrils. Sulphur, Holmes muttered, and phosphorus. A small charred mark had appeared upon the wall outside Captain Hathaway's room. No flame had been seen. No one had been heard moving. And yet, the air still pulsed with heat. Holmes turned to me, his eyes glittering with resolve. Our phantom now plays with fire. Let us see how well he fares with logic. The household rose in turmoil the following morning. A loud knock upon my door roused me at dawn, and I found Miss Beatrice in the corridor, her dressing gown hastily drawn, her face pale with astonishment. "It's back," she whispered. "The chest. It's back." Holmes was already awake and fully dressed. We followed her swiftly to Captain Hathaway's room. There, resting squarely at the foot of the bed, stood the missing treasure chest. Dark wood, brass-bound, and unmistakable in its design. It had not been there the night before. Holmes examined the floor. No scuff marks, no signs of dragging. The windows remained locked from within, and Hathaway himself swore he had neither seen nor heard anything in the night. "Open it," Holmes said. With shaking hands, Hathaway knelt and lifted the lid. It creaked slowly upward. Inside, nothing. Only the faint scent of damp wood and the dusty imprint where valuables had once lain. "The chest has returned," Holmes murmured, "but its contents have not." Beatrice took a cautious step forward. "Then it was stolen?" Holmes gave a slight shake of the head. "It was removed, certainly. But whether stolen or merely hidden remains to be seen. No thief would go to such lengths to return the vessel, unless it served a greater purpose." "To frighten us," Beatrice whispered. "Or to distract us," Holmes replied. He moved toward the wardrobe and ran his fingers along the interior panels. "This house is not merely old. It is layered. There are voids in its structure. Passages, perhaps, unused for generations. Whoever brought the chest here did not walk through the front door." Captain Hathaway sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "I am losing my mind, Mr. Holmes. First a ghost, now a vanishing treasure that reappears on its own." "No, Captain," Holmes said gently. "You are merely witnessing the performance of a very skilled illusionist." He turned to me with quiet intensity. "We must move swiftly now, Watson. Our adversary has made his boldest move yet. And in doing so, he has made his first real mistake." Diwali approached with silent inevitability, its promise of light standing in ironic contrast to the deepening gloom within Hathaway Manor. The household, though not openly acknowledging it, moved as though expecting some great reckoning. Holmes, for his part, remained wholly occupied, his mind sharper and more focused than I had seen it in weeks. "Diwali," he said to me that morning, "is a festival of illumination, of clarity dispelling obscurity. A poetic irony, Watson, that our adversary has chosen such a night for his final deception. You expect he will strike again? I would stake my violin upon it. The pattern has escalated, illusion upon illusion, each more brazen than the last. The return of the empty chest was a desperate flourish, a conjurer's final distraction. Now he must either act or vanish altogether." That afternoon, Holmes disappeared for several hours, returning only after dusk with 2 oil lamps of a peculiar design, several mirrors wrapped in cloth, and a spool of twine which he tucked into his coat without explanation. He declined dinner and spent the early evening with Captain Hathaway in the study, securing the latter's agreement to a series of unorthodox precautions. I was not privy to the conversation, but could see, by Hathaway's pale complexion and muttered acceptance, that Holmes had laid out a plan both daring and exacting. At last, as the first fireworks crackled in the distant village, Holmes turned to me. "Tonight, Watson," he said quietly, "we abandon the hunt and take to the stage. Let the ghost perform his final act. I intend to be waiting in the wings." It was nearing 10 o'clock when Holmes summoned me to the upper landing, now dimly lit by the 2 modified oil lamps he had acquired. He had positioned them at opposite ends of the corridor, their chimneys removed and their light carefully filtered through panes of coloured glass. The effect was unsettling, a flickering, uneven glow that threw long shadows upon the walls. "Light, Watson," he remarked, adjusting the angle of a mirror with care, "is the first ally of illusion, but in the hands of reason, it becomes the ghost's undoing." He handed me a revolver and gestured toward a tall urn in the corner alcove. "Remain here. If anything should go awry, do not hesitate." "Do you expect resistance?" I asked. "I expect theatre," he replied, "but even the most dramatic player may carry a dagger behind his costume." Holmes then took Miss Beatrice into his confidence, instructing her firmly to remain within the safety of the cellar and to admit no one but himself or myself. Though visibly shaken, she obeyed without protest. He gave her a lantern, locked the cellar door from the outside, and pocketed the key. Returning to the upper floor, Holmes placed small chalk marks upon the floorboards and drew the curtains in the adjacent parlour, creating a single path bathed in ghostly light. We waited in silence for the appointed hour. The house had grown utterly still. Outside, distant drums and bursts of celebration echoed faintly across the fields. Within, however, not a soul stirred, save for Holmes, crouched behind the doorframe, every line of his figure coiled like a spring. I confess, as the final moments crept toward midnight, I felt the first tinge of doubt. But Holmes, ever serene, whispered only one word: now. The stroke of midnight had scarcely faded from the hall clock when it appeared. At first, it was no more than a shimmer, a wavering blur at the far end of the corridor, half-formed and indistinct. Then it took shape. Tall, cloaked in white, a turbaned head rising above shadowed shoulders. It moved without sound, gliding with spectral grace toward the landing, arms slightly raised, as though in benediction or warning. My hand tightened upon the revolver, but I held my ground. Holmes did not move. The figure passed beneath one of the modified lamps. A subtle shift of light caused the shape to ripple, flicker, almost as if it were bending in on itself. And yet, it continued forward, unaffected by its own unreality. Then came Holmes's movement, swift, silent, and precise. He sprang from the alcove and dashed toward the figure. There was a gasp, a stumble, and the spectre turned in what could only be described as human panic. Holmes seized the edge of the flowing garment, pulling it away to reveal a dark-clad figure beneath. The white robe slipped to the floor as the man broke into a run, dashing toward the chapel door at the far end of the corridor. I gave chase, while Holmes turned to the mirrored wall and tapped it twice with his cane. A section of panelling creaked open. I followed through and found myself in a narrow stone passage that twisted down toward the east wing. There, cornered by a dead end, the intruder wheeled around. It was Reverend Ellison, his face pale, eyes wild, shirt marked with traces of phosphorescent paint and fine ash. Holmes stepped forward calmly. "Theatre," he said, "is a noble pursuit, Reverend, but I believe you have overstayed your engagement." Reverend Ellison stood frozen, the folds of his once sacred vestments now cast aside to reveal the far less pious garb of a deceiver. His breathing was laboured, his hands streaked with powdery residue, and a smear of luminous paint glowed faintly along the collar of his shirt, rendering him more ghoulish in truth than his spectral impersonation had ever been in fiction. Holmes regarded him coolly. "The phosphorescence is quite effective under filtered light," he said, and the white silk robe, with its hidden rigging for gliding movement, was a theatrical touch worthy of the London stage. But alas, your performance was undone by a broken monocle and an imperfect memory of the corridor's dimensions. Ellison said nothing. His gaze darted toward the sealed end of the passage, as if weighing the chances of another escape. Holmes gave no such opportunity. "The hidden door," he continued, "leads from the chapel vestry. You discovered it during your previous visits to the manor, ostensibly as a guest and spiritual advisor, but in truth as a man surveying his stage. Once you had access to the vault and knowledge of the treasure's legend, it required only planning and a partner." I stepped forward. "But why, Reverend? Why such a grotesque charade?" Holmes answered in his place. "Because a ghost cannot be prosecuted. Because fear is the surest guard against intrusion. And because Ellison believed that the past, if buried deep enough beneath superstition, would never rise to speak again. Ellison's lips twitched, and for the first time he spoke. "You English forget nothing, but you forgive even less." Holmes did not flinch. "It is not forgiveness I deal in, sir. It is truth." With that, he turned to me. "Come, Watson. There remains one more door to open, and I believe it lies beneath the chapel floor." The old chapel was dark when we arrived, its windows shrouded and its pews layered with dust from years of neglect. Holmes moved with unerring purpose to the eastern wall, where he pressed upon a carved panel just beneath the altar. A soft click answered his touch, and a section of the stone floor shifted inward with a groan. A stairway descended into the gloom. We followed Holmes downward into a narrow corridor lined with mouldering brick. At the far end, he produced a lantern and revealed a low wooden door, secured not with a lock, but a sliding bolt from within. Holmes knocked twice. The bolt scraped open. Inside, crouched beside a stack of aged crates, was Amrit Das. He did not startle at our entrance. He merely stood, his face resigned. Holmes surveyed the contents quickly. Jewels, coins, artifacts, some East Indian, others European. A trove assembled over decades, hidden beneath sacred ground, smuggled piece by piece into these crates, awaiting quiet transport abroad. Captain Hathaway, who had joined us in silence, now stepped forward. "Das," he said hoarsely. "Why?" The butler bowed his head. "Because the treasure was never yours to inherit, Captain. It was bought with blood and betrayal. My uncle's blood, my father's shame." "You worked with Ellison?" I asked. Das nodded. "He approached me with promises and threats. He had records, letters from the Colonel's campaigns, proof of what was taken. He meant to sell it, use the legend to drive your family away. I helped him open the vault, but I did not know he would go so far." Holmes studied him a long moment. "You were not the architect, but you were the key." Das met his gaze. "I do not deny it." Holmes turned to the captain. "The treasure may yet be claimed, but its legacy cannot be so easily cleansed." The final reckoning was conducted without flourish. Reverend Ellison, arrested the following morning, remained silent under questioning, refusing either confession or defense. The evidence, however, required neither. His possession of forged documents, his access to the vault, and the mechanisms of the ghostly illusions were proof enough of guilt. Amrit Das, for his part, did not flee. Instead, he offered a complete account of his actions and accepted the legal consequences with a quiet dignity that neither Holmes nor I could wholly condemn. In the end, he was spared the full weight of the law, receiving leniency in light of Ellison's coercion and his ultimate cooperation. Captain Hathaway withdrew from public life, the weight of his uncle's colonial legacy pressing more heavily upon his conscience than any tribunal could demand. It was Miss Beatrice who assumed stewardship of the estate, dedicating its restoration to historical truth and charitable ends. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in the first days of November, the air crisp and mercifully free of incense and secrets. As we sat once more by our fire, I turned to him. "You knew it was Ellison from the start." "I suspected," Holmes replied. "But suspicion, Watson, is like smoke. It may obscure, but only the flame reveals the fire's source." He paused, drawing from his pipe with slow deliberation. In this case, the ghost wore the face of empire, guilt, and greed, a fitting mask for a nation's unfinished business. It was a relief to find ourselves once again within the familiar walls of 221B Baker Street. The autumn wind rattled faintly at the panes, and Mrs. Hudson had, in her quiet wisdom, ensured a warm fire awaited our return. Holmes, ever unchanged in his manner, removed his overcoat with the same indifference he had worn during the capture of Ellison, and promptly took up his customary position with pipe in hand. For my part, I found the contrast between the Gothic unrest of Hathaway Manor and the domestic tranquillity of our lodging so jarring that I scarcely spoke for several minutes. It was only when Holmes stirred from his reverie that I finally gave voice to the thoughts that had long lingered at the edges of my mind. "There are parts of this case," I said, "which still elude me. The ghost, the treasure, the messages. It was all so elaborately orchestrated, and yet not a single supernatural occurrence proved genuine." Holmes gave a slight smile, more one of reflection than amusement. "You are not alone in that impression, Watson. Deception thrives where tradition and fear entwine. But let us, as always, begin with the facts." He reached for the notebook upon his desk, its pages already half filled with neatly penned observations. "This was no haunting, my dear fellow. It was a performance, an act of misdirection worthy of the finest magician. And like any illusion, once examined under the lens of logic, it collapses into its components." I nodded slowly, though I sensed that the fullest picture had yet to be revealed. Holmes tapped ash from his pipe and said, "Come. Let us dissect the phantom limb by limb." Holmes began with the simplest truth, as he often did. There was no ghost, Watson, only the idea of one, rendered so vividly through light, scent, sound, and superstition that even the rational mind hesitated. That in itself is a testament to the scheme's sophistication. I nodded. The robe, the turban, the glowing paint. It was convincing, particularly in the dim corridors of the manor. Precisely, the phosphorescent substance used by Ellison was derived from phosphorus salts, available through any chemist of modest stock. Under diffused light, particularly that filtered through blue glass, it produces an ethereal glow quite unlike ordinary flame. When paired with the robe and careful movements along known paths, the illusion became effective. And the noises, some natural, old pipes, loose boards, others fabricated. A series of concealed wires within the panelling allowed vibrations to carry sound to distant parts of the house. You may recall the faint tapping on the third night. That was no coincidence. The illusion was sustained through repetition and reinforcement. But to what end? Holmes leaned back slightly, the fire's glow playing upon his features. Fear, Watson. Pure and calculated fear. Once Hathaway and his staff were sufficiently unnerved, the treasure could be moved or made to vanish without scrutiny. What's more, the ghost story provided a convenient cover for any gaps in the narrative. After all, who questions the illogical when terrified? And the chest's return. Ah, a masterstroke of drama. The chest reappeared not to deliver truth but to seal confusion. A final act to overwhelm the senses. I shook my head slowly. "And the servants believed it all?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Not all. But belief, Watson, is contagious, particularly when fanned by grief, guilt, or legend." He paused, and I detected the familiar gleam of satisfaction in his eye. The ghost never existed, but the fear it inspired, that I assure you was very real. Holmes reached into the drawer of his desk and withdrew the small fractured lens he had retrieved near the drawing room. He held it up between two fingers, inspecting it once more under the light. "This," he said, "was perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle, because it was the first thing not meant to be found." I leaned forward. "Dropped by accident." "Indeed. During Ellison's nocturnal venture into the vault, You will recall, Watson, that we discovered no sign of forced entry, and yet the chest had vanished. The conclusion was simple. The entrance had not been forced. It had been used by someone who knew of the hidden mechanism. Holmes turned the lens over in his hand. Ellison had, during his prior visits to the manor, gained access to plans of the estate, likely while offering his so-called spiritual counsel. He discovered the concealed panel beneath the chapel and the passage that led directly to the vault's rear wall. From there, it was but a matter of timing. But the monocle, Holmes smiled, a detail out of place. Reverend Ellison was nearsighted, a fact he took pains to conceal while performing. He removed his spectacles during each ghostly appearance, but required a monocle for reading and close work. He dropped it while retrieving or inspecting the chest, perhaps startled by a sound. I studied the delicate lens. So a moment of human frailty revealed the inhuman deception. Exactly, Holmes replied. And once I traced the make of the monocle to a particular London optician, one who confirmed a recent purchase by a clergyman of Ellison's description, the remainder fell into place. He placed the lens back in the drawer and closed it gently. In a case built upon shadows and superstition, it was the most fragile, most human error that shattered the illusion. A cracked lens, Watson, but a clear truth. Holmes turned once more to his notes, tapping a finger upon the margin, where several entries were linked by underlines and curious symbols. He then rose, fetched a small parcel from the sideboard, and unwrapped it upon the table between us. Within lay a square of stained cloth, a shallow dish of grey powder, and a sliver of what appeared to be burnt incense. The sensory elements of this case, he began, were among its most effective, and, not coincidentally, its most deliberately misleading. Let us consider first the scent, sandalwood, a fragrance steeped in Eastern associations. Its use was calculated to evoke the mysticism of the Raj and to cast suspicion upon Amrit Das. I recalled the lingering trace of perfume that had so often preceded the so-called ghost's appearance. You believe it was deliberately placed? Without question, a vial of sandalwood oil, diluted and applied by brush to the door frames and window sills on alternating nights. I retrieved the bottle from beneath the vestry floorboards. He held up a small, stoppered container. It was meant to implant suggestion that an otherworldly presence had passed. And the bloodstain? I asked. Iron oxide, mixed with animal fat and applied in small quantities to the flagstones. The mixture oxidizes upon contact with air and moisture, producing a convincing rust-red smear. It is employed by stage illusionists to mimic old blood. The stain returned each morning because it was reapplied each night. He opened the parcel further and revealed a residue-stained brush. This was discovered in the base of the chapel's altar. I sat back in my chair, marvelling at the ingenuity of the deception. Holmes smiled faintly. Therein lies the subtlety, Watson. The ghost did not merely appear. He was felt, smelled, heard. Every sense was engaged. It was not a haunting. It was a symphony of trickery. And all orchestrated by a man of the cloth, I murmured. Holmes gave a slow nod. A reminder, if we needed one, that appearances, however pious, can be but veils over motive. Holmes remained silent for a moment, his gaze lost in the fire. Then he spoke, his voice low but measured. Every crime begins long before its commission, Watson. It germinates in grievance, ripens in silence, and blooms in opportunity. To understand Ellison's plot, we must revisit the days when empire cloaked avarice in the robes of duty. I had heard Holmes speak cynically before, but seldom with such deliberate restraint. Reverend Josiah Ellison was once posted as a missionary in the Bengal district. He continued. There, he befriended a young officer by the name of Colonel Josiah Hathaway. The two were stationed near Calcutta, and it was during this period that Hathaway acquired, under dubious circumstances, a number of valuables entrusted to him by a local nobleman during the unrest of 1857. The same nobleman whose execution Amrit Das spoke of, I asked. Precisely. Hathaway returned to England with his fortune. Ellison, dismissed from his post for undisclosed reasons, languished in obscurity. But he had kept meticulous records, notes, letters, receipts. Perhaps at the time they were nothing more than the jottings of an envious clergyman. But years later, when Hathaway passed and the treasure's legend resurfaced, Ellison saw his chance. He turned to me. Imagine his position. He had no legal claim, no rightful grievance, only knowledge, bitterness, and the wit to manipulate both. He could not seize the treasure openly, but if he could frighten the household into retreat, the manor would stand empty, and the vault accessible. And Amrit Das? Das was the reluctant accomplice, lured by the promise of reparation, threatened by the spectre of his father's past. He knew the history was true but could not see the future clearly. By the time he realized Ellison's methods, he was already complicit. Holmes's voice softened. This was not merely a crime of greed, Watson. It was a reckoning, a delayed echo of colonial theft dressed in the language of ghosts. In the weeks that followed our return to London, I received a letter from Miss Beatrice Hathaway, now formerly the mistress of Hathaway Manor. The tone was one of resolve, tempered by sorrow. She wrote of repairs begun, of charitable projects planned, with the estate's recovered wealth, and of a quiet wish to preserve the house not as a monument to privilege, but as a lesson in consequence. Captain Hathaway, by contrast, had withdrawn entirely from society. His final note to Holmes was brief and without self-pity. He spoke of errors inherited and trust misplaced, and of a burden he did not believe would lighten in his lifetime. Holmes read the letter in silence and then burned it in the fire without comment. As for Amrit Das, he returned to Calcutta of his own accord, unshackled from both Ellison and Hathaway, though not, I suspect, from the weight of memory. Holmes arranged for a quiet legal defence and, in his own way, ensured the man would not be ruined. We spoke no more of ghosts after that. But as I watched Holmes one evening, his profile outlined against the lamplight, I could not help but feel that this case had touched something deeper within him. Not horror, nor pity, but the recognition of something long understood, that the most dangerous spectres are not those which haunt our halls, but those which linger in our histories. And so the matter of the East India treasure was laid to rest, not by exorcism or incantation, but by the clear light of reason. The ghost, we discovered, had never walked, yet it had caused fear, flight, and near ruin. It had been conjured not from the grave, but from the embers of old wounds, fanned by guilt and greed, into something monstrous. In the quiet that followed our final discussion of the affair, Holmes lit his pipe and regarded me with that curious, distant gaze he so often wore when a case had concluded. "Watson," he said, "the dead may not walk, but the living often wear their shrouds long before the grave." It was a line I would remember always. For in that moment, I understood he was not merely speaking of Ellison or Hathaway, but of us all. As the last of the autumn rain tapped gently at the window panes of Baker Street, Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded in thought. "You know, Watson," he said at last, "it was not the paint, nor the passage, nor even the treasure that most fascinated me." "Oh?" I replied, setting down my pen. "Then what, pray, held your attention so?" He exhaled a thin wisp of smoke. "The ease with which a man can wrap himself in righteousness while cloaking treachery. A clergyman conjures a ghost, a butler wrestles with conscience, and a soldier inherits the sins of his forebears, yet all of them believe themselves, in some way, justified." I considered this for a moment. Then what of the legend, the sepoy's curse, the blood stain, the whispers in the night? "Puppets, Watson," Holmes said dryly. "Well-dressed puppets dancing at the ends of old imperial strings. In the end, the ghost was never the villain. It was merely the mask worn by those who could not bear to face the living truth." But now, dear reader, what do you think was the criminal's greatest misstep? Was it Ellison's arrogance, Amrit Das's silence, or perhaps Holmes's unerring eye for the smallest detail that truly unravelled the ghost's illusion? If this mystery stirred your imagination as much as it stirred ours, do share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you delight in the shadows, secrets, and sharp deductions of Sherlock Holmes, be sure to subscribe for more timeless cases. And share this tale with a fellow mystery lover who dares to chase the truth through fog and fiction. The game, dear friends, is always afoot.